welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Before we really plunge in today, just a quick moment. If you're someone who, like us, really tries to find clarity when things get complex, if you believe that, understanding is actually a powerful force, well, consider joining our community.
Yeah.
Be part of that light, maybe, that helps cut through some of the noise.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time with these sources, trying to bring you insights, help you connect the dots, and honestly, your engagement, that fuels this whole thing.
Yeah.
So if you find value here, please like, share, and subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube. Every click, every share, it really helps us reach more people asking the same questions.
It really does.
You can also find our other deep dives wherever you listen and connect with us on X, Instagram, and Threads. Your support truly makes all this possible.
Okay.
So today, we are undertaking a deep dive into quite a stack of sources. They paint a pretty stark picture, really, of the Gaza ceasefire negotiations.
Right. Intricate stuff.
Intricate, often frustrating, and it's all set against this backdrop of a just devastating humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to try and pull out the key insights, look at the different viewpoints, sometimes conflicting ones, and, well, the undeniable realities that are laid bare in this material. Hopefully give you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of what's going on.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. The sources really frame the current situation, obviously, within the context of the war since October 2023. But specifically, they highlight that a previous ceasefire collapsed, around March 2025?
Yeah, that's right.
And this history, this pattern of failed truces, it's a really critical piece of the picture the sources are drawing, especially because the humanitarian situation on the ground, well, it's only gotten worse.
Which adds immense pressure.
Immense pressure and complexity to any new negotiation effort.
Okay, so the latest effort the sources seem to be focusing on is this U.S.-backed plan, reportedly brought forward by U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff. What are the main parts of that one?
Right. This proposal, as the material describes it, it calls for a 60-day halt to hostilities. That's the duration.
62 days.
And the core of it is an exchange. Hamas would release 10 living Israeli hostages and also the bodies of 18 others.
And how would that happen all at once?
Well, one source specifically mentions phases, like half released on day 1, the other half on day 7.
Okay. And what's the other side of that exchange? What would Israel do?
In return, Israel would release a pretty substantial number of Palestinian prisoners. The figures cited are 125 who are serving life sentences.
Wow.
Plus another 11,111 detainees held since the start of the war, and also the remains of 180 dead Palestinians.
So significant numbers on both sides there. Does the proposal mention aid?
Yes, crucially, it includes commitments for daily humanitarian aid deliveries into Gaza. And also, importantly, that negotiations for a permanent end to hostilities would actually start during that 60-day pause. Ah, okay. So there's a humanitarian piece and, well, at least a potential path, maybe fragile, but a path towards something more lasting built into this U.S. plan.
That's the idea presented, yes.
So what do the sources tell us about Israel's position on this specific plan?
Well, reports indicate the White House actually stated that Israel had, quote, signed off on it and backed and supported it even before it went to Hamas.
Okay, so they were on board initially.
Seemingly. However, Israeli officials, as described in the sources now, are reportedly taking a pretty firm stance. They're insisting the proposal has to be accepted as is, meaning any additions, any reservations from Hamas.
Yeah.
Well, they suggest that would basically mean starting negotiations all over again, back to square one.
Right, which brings us then to Hamas's response. The sources describe that as ambiguous, conditional.
Exactly. Conditional is a good word. Hamas has reportedly sent back its reply, and it's characterized not as a flat-out rejection, no, but more like a conditional yes.
They're seeking some pretty significant changes, attaching specific conditions before they'll fully accept.
What are the big conditions? What are they pushing for?
The sources highlight several key things. First, Hamas is reportedly demanding a permanent ceasefire, not just the 60-day stop.
Right, a full end.
Second, they want a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, potentially even specifying a pullback to the positions they held before March 18th, 2025.
Okay, withdrawal. What else?
Third, they're seeking stronger guarantees for aid, continuous flow of humanitarian aid. And specifically, they seem to prefer that aid distribution inside Gaza uses trucks that were previously seized by Hamas.
Interesting.
Rather than using this new U.S.-backed mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF.
Okay, so control over aid distribution seems key.
Seems to be. They also propose a different schedule for releasing the hostages. They want them staggered over the whole 60 days, not just bunched up in the first week.
Spread it out.
Yeah. And finally, they are reportedly looking for a U.S. guarantee, some kind of American backing to help enforce whatever ceasefire is agreed upon.
It sounds like these conditions, especially the permanent ceasefire and withdrawal, are maybe linked to what happened last time with the previous ceasefire collapsing.
That's definitely the context the sources provide, yes. The desire to avoid a repeat, fighting resumes quickly, aid gets halted again, Israeli operations ramp up. That seems to be driving these demands.
Yeah.
There's even a specific mention of concern about something called Operation Gideon's Chariots, presumably a reference to Israeli military actions after the last truce failed.
That context is really important. But interestingly, the sources also mentioned something else, that Palestinian factions inside Gaza have apparently urged the Hamas leadership to just accept the current proposal.
Yeah, that's a powerful detail coming out of the sources.
Seeing it as, maybe despite the flaws, the best shot to stop the fighting and help with the crisis.
Exactly. Pressure coming from the population that's actually living through it day to day. It really underscores the desperation on the ground.
So, navigating all this obviously involves mediators. Who do the sources point to as the key players trying to bridge these gaps?
Egypt comes up consistently. It's highlighted as holding a, quote, unique position.
Why unique?
Well, its peace treaty with Israel, going back 46 years now, gives it a special channel. Plus, it has direct ties with Hamas and other Palestinian groups. And, sharing a border with both Gaza and Israel gives Egypt a very direct stake and, well, leverage, built on decades of experience in these kinds of negotiations.
And the sources also mentioned Egypt's very strong feelings about the future of Gaza's population, didn't they?
Absolutely. The material notes Egypt is unequivocally opposed to any ideas about permanently relocating Gaza's, 2 million people, to Egypt and Jordan.
An idea reportedly floated by President Trump.
That's what the sources mentioned, yeah. Post-inauguration, Egypt apparently sees this as a deeply destabilizing red line, a national security threat that could even put its peace treaty with Israel at risk.
Wow.
The sources even say Egypt is building up defenses in the Sinai, just in case, as a precaution.
So Egypt isn't just saying no to that idea. They're also, according to reports, drafting their own plots for what could happen next.
Yes, exactly. Reports indicate Egypt is developing alternative frameworks. Thinking about massive reconstruction efforts, the estimates mentioned range from $50 billion up to $80 billion.
Huge sums.
Huge. And ideas for governance structures after the conflict, maybe involving a temporary Palestinian authority, but without Hamas, with retrained security forces, that kind of thing.
With a key condition.
A core condition, yes. Running through all these Egyptian plans, according to the sources, Palestinians must remain on their land. No mass displacement.
Okay.
And these initiatives, they're framed as maybe starting points for a peace process down the line. Egypt's reportedly working with other Arab states, too, like Saudi Arabia.
What about Qatar? They've been a very prominent mediator.
Yeah, well, the sources report Qatar has actually suspended its role. Stepped back for now.
Suspended? Why?
They stated they'll only resume when the parties show, quote, willingness and seriousness to actually negotiate. Reports suggest this might have followed some U.S. pressure about Hamas having a presence in Doha and accusations that Hamas had rejected earlier proposals. Though it's worth noting, Qatar apparently denied reports that they were closing the Hamas office there.
Okay, so another layer of diplomatic complexity, with Qatar stepping back for now.
Exactly. It just highlights how fragile everything is.
So, if we put it all together based on these sources, Israel saying take the deal as is, Hamas demanding major changes like withdrawal, aid control, what's the likely immediate outcome for this specific proposal?
Honestly, the sources really point towards a likely deadlock, at least for now. The positions described seem pretty far apart. Israel's rigidity versus Hamas's demands for fundamental shifts. It makes a quick resolution seem highly improbable based on this material.
And there are other unresolved things, too.
Yeah, crucial, sensitive issues. The sources note haven't even really been tackled yet in the proximity talks, the indirect talks through mediators, like which specific hostages would be released and the exact mechanism for aid distribution. These big sticking points haven't been fully engaged yet, adding more layers of difficulty.
Okay. So while these really complex, potentially deadlocked negotiations are happening, the sources simultaneously just lay bare this crushing reality of the humanitarian crisis on the ground. The scale is just immense.
It really is. The casualty figures reported by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry are just staggering. As of late May 2025, they're reporting at least 54,084 killed and 123,308 injured since October 7th, 2023.
Huge numbers.
Huge. But it is important, and the sources themselves point this out, that this tally doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. The material also raises some questions about the methodology the ministry uses, noting things like an opaque revision process, how family reports are vetted, and it acknowledges there are unknowns, like unreported deaths, missing people, that could significantly change the narrative later on.
And even with talks potentially stalled, the violence continues.
Yes, one source from May 31st, 2025, specifically reported heavy Israeli strikes were still happening across Gaza, killing 60 people in just the previous 24 hours.
And the toll on aid workers.
Heartbreakingly high. The sources mention at least 310 UNRWA team members killed since October 7th, 2023.
Just unbelievable. Beyond the casualties, mass displacement seems to define life for Gazans now, according to these sources.
The scale is almost unimaginable. At least 1.9 million people, that's roughly 90% of the entire population, displaced during the war, and many of them forced to move multiple times.
And it's still happening.
Oh yes, it's not static. Since that ceasefire collapsed back in March, tens of thousands have been displaced again. Over 632,700 people since mid-March, and over 195,000 just in a 2-week period in late May.
Where can they even go? The sources talk about shrinking safe areas.
That's a critical point from the sources, yeah. 81% of the entire Gaza Strip is now either inside an Israeli militarized zone or under a specific displacement order, or where those two things overlap.
81%.
Yeah. The material highlights multiple recent displacement orders that have basically emptied large areas, forcing people out of UNRWA facilities where they were sheltering.
Which leads us straight into the aid crisis. The sources describe this in really, really devastating terms.
Yeah. The Israeli blockade, which lasted nearly 3 months, it pushed the population right to the brink of famine. The UN is quoted in the sources calling Gaza the hungriest place on earth.
Hungriest place on earth.
And aid entry itself, just getting aid in, was effectively under siege for almost 80 days, from early March to mid-May. While Israeli authorities did allow some limited aid to resume starting May 19th, it's repeatedly described in the sources as just a trickle, or like a teaspoon compared to the overwhelming need.
And even when some aid gets across the border, getting it to the people inside Gaza, that's another huge problem.
Absolutely. The sources detail immense challenges for distributing aid internally. Convoys face denied access, their movements are impeded, even planned routes that were coordinated with Israeli authorities often get blocked or slowed way down.
Why?
Ongoing fighting is a major factor, obviously creates danger. But reports also indicate Israeli forces have sometimes directed UN aid operations onto unsecured routes where armed groups are active.
Yeah.
The UN is calling it one of the most obstructed aid operations in recent history.
And this difficulty, this desperation, it seems linked to some really disturbing reports about aid looting.
Yes, the sources report multiple incidents, aid trucks being stopped, offloaded, sometimes by what are described as hungry people, desperate civilians, or even thousands of people.
It's just desperation.
Well, this is where the sources present differing interpretations. The World Food Program, the WFP, they confirmed incidents, like a warehouse break-in, and they frame it as driven by sheer desperation. Their executive director is quoted saying things like, "These people are starving to death, they run for it, and that it doesn't have anything to do with Hamas siphoning."
Others disagree.
Conversely, the sources note Israeli accusations that Hamas is significantly diverting aid, although the UN denies that large-scale siphoning like that is happening, though conflicting narratives there.
And the very systems, the mechanisms for distributing aid, they seem to be a major point of controversy now, too.
Yeah.
Especially with this new system being introduced.
Yeah, well, UNRWA, which has been the main UN agency doing this work, they're facing immense challenges. Their international staff have been banned from entering Gaza since March due to Israeli laws. About half of their facilities are now in these militarized zones or under displacement orders. Supplies are dwindling, essential medicines running out, pesticide stocks low, or gone completely. But despite all that, the Palestinian UNRWA staff, they're still working, still providing services where they can.
And then there's this new GHF, the U.S. and Israeli-backed one.
Yes. The sources mention the new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF. It has started operating, distributing food, but it's described as a chaotic rollout.
Chaotic.
Yeah, and this mechanism has drawn incredibly sharp criticism. OCHA, that's the UN's humanitarian coordination body, they've described it using terms like a new militarized distribution system.
Militarized.
Yeah, and surveillance-based rationing, even engineered scarcity.
Engineered scarcity. Those are really strong words.
They are. Powerful terms suggesting the system isn't just maybe inefficient, but potentially designed in a way that controls aid based on surveillance or other criteria that aren't purely humanitarian, putting people at risk, failing to meet needs with dignity. That's the criticism being reported.
So we're seeing these different views presented in the sources about who's ultimately responsible for the aid problems.
Exactly. You have Israeli officials quoted claiming the UN isn't effectively doing their job, distributing aid.
Right.
And then you have UN officials pushing back, pointing to the severe access constraints they face, the fighting, the sheer scale of the crisis, arguing these are the real issues made worse by the long siege.
Beyond just food and shelter, how has this crisis impacted other essential services, like healthcare, water, even farming?
Oh, the sources paint a devastating picture right across the board. Healthcare. Only 19 out of 36 hospitals in Gaza are reportedly even partially operational. Most have been damaged or destroyed. There's a critical shortage of hospital beds.
19 out of 36.
Yeah. UNRWA health centers are still providing primary care, mental health services where they can, but their status changes all the time.
And water and sanitation. Galia services.
Big problems there, too. Critical assets are in those militarized zones. Infrastructure is severely damaged. The fuel crisis cripples everything. This is leading to piles of solid waste building up, creating conditions ripe for disease outbreaks.
Like cholera.
That's the fear, yeah. UNRWA is doing some limited water delivery and waste collection, but they're hampered by supply shortages, too.
And what about the ability of people in Gaza to feed themselves in the longer term? Agriculture.
Catastrophic state, according to the sources. Over 80% of cropland is damaged. Nearly 78% is completely inaccessible to farmers now.
So they can't even grow food.
Exactly. The term used is the collapse of Gaza's agri-food system. It's not just about immediate food aid anymore. It's the destruction of the very means for people to produce their own food in the future.
That's terrifying.
It is. And there's one more specific crisis noted, a menstrual hygiene emergency, affecting nearly 700,000 women and girls. Over 75% of their monthly need for sanitary pads isn't being met, which has huge impacts on their well-being, their safety.
It's layer upon layer of crisis.
Yeah. So if you sort of connect the dots here, it becomes really clear how the lack of any breakthrough in those complex ceasefire talks we discussed earlier, how that directly impacts the situation on the ground. It just prolongs the crisis, fuels the desperation.
And at the same time, the sheer severity of that humanitarian crisis,
Yeah.
the hunger, the displacement, the collapse of basic services, that adds layers of immense pressure and complexity back onto those very same talks, makes them even harder to navigate.
It's a vicious cycle described in these sources.
We've taken a deep dive today into this really challenging world presented in the sources. We've tried to explore the intricate dynamics of the Gaza ceasefire negotiations and this devastating humanitarian crisis unfolding alongside it. We've unpacked the details of the proposed plans, the conditional responses we're seeing, the difficult roles played by mediators like Egypt and now maybe less so Qatar. And, well, the heart-wrenching realities on the ground.
Yeah, the reported casualties, the mass displacement, the struggle just for aid, the different views on why distribution fails, the collapse of essential services.
Right. And this journey through the sources, it really leaves us, I think, with a profound question. We've seen these political negotiations kind of bogged down, right, by conditions, guarantees, mistrust.
Clause-by-clause debates.
Exactly. And at the same time, we've seen this stark reality of immense human suffering described in such visceral detail. A situation some sources even call engineered scarcity.
So the question the sources implicitly pose is this. In a landscape where these proposed solutions are debated point by point, how does the international system, how does anyone truly bridge that massive gap, the gap between the political deadlock at the negotiating table and the urgent, undeniable human need that's just laid bare in these sources?
It's a heavy question to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on the deep dive. If the insights we've shared today helped you make sense of even a small fraction of this incredibly complex picture, if maybe they sparked a new thought or brought some clarity to the news you see every day, well then, our mission is succeeding.
Yeah,
Please consider supporting the work we do here. Like, share, and subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube. By doing that, you really become part of this effort, trying to turn information overload into actual understanding. Explore our other deep dives wherever you find your podcasts, and please follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads. Let's continue this journey of exploration together.